is June 26. Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation. My name is Olena, and now we will be talking about revamping housing policy as a part of the Ukrainian Facility Initiative. Joining us in the studio is Olena Shulyak, head of the Parliamentary Committee on Local Governance, Regional Development and Urban Planning. Good morning, Ms. Olena. Good morning. Thank you for having me here. So today we'll be talking about a very important topic. So on the 20th of June, the Parliament has adopted one of the first draft laws which serve as an indicator of Ukraine facility, the document that contemplates the fact that Ukraine would receive 50 billion euro, and one of these draft laws was the law on public consultations. It's adopted by the Parliament. It's just about to be signed by the President, and it will come into effect after the end of the martial law. It says that all of the bodies of the central and local governments, before adopting any serious decisions, specifically those related to formulation of government policies in different areas. So today we will be talking about such area as housing policies, so that the governments should have consultations with the members of their communities before adopting this or that resolution. So without waiting for this law to come into force, we, in coordination with our partners, USAID and Interactive Republic NGO, we've held public consultations on housing policy, and today we will have a presentation of the report on this public consultation. We were working in online mode, and we were able to engage 510 unique participants in our public consultations. This format enabled us to invite the representatives of local governments, the representatives of the IDPs, the representatives of veteran communities, different social strata, to understand and to answer the key question: how does the government formulate the housing policy, and what should they do in order to ensure the equal access to the housing for all of the citizens? So the matter of housing policy, just like the matter of public consultations, is contemplated by Ukraine facility. The government undertakes a responsibility to develop the new housing strategy and to adopt relevant legislation. Unfortunately, currently, the housing codex works in Ukraine, is in effect in Ukraine, that was adopted back in 1983, and I think that 80 or maybe 90% of the provisions of that code just do not work. And the full-scale invasion, along with our Euro integration aspirations, highlighted those problems with the housing policy and the necessity of its reformation. So what are the key problems that we have today in the area of housing policy? We have about 600,000 citizens of Ukrainians in queue to be provided with the housing. They spent like decades in that queue, and it's not moving. People still stay without their constitutional right for housing, and 1 in 3 citizens of our country has extremely low level of income that would never allow them to buy their own housing. And again, there are more categories added, just like our servicemen. More than 1 million of them are veterans that we expect to have after the victory. And with the members of their families, it's about 400 million citizens. And let's not forget about the new category of population that was significantly increased since year 2014, the internally displaced persons. So currently there are 4.9 million officially registered IDPs, but in fact the number of such people is way bigger. And to solve all those problems for the servicemen, for IDPs, for the veteran communities, for the young specialists who get involved in different work, for example, like education service field and other young specialists. So we have to review our legislation to reformulate the housing policy, and the Ministry of Reconstruction has developed a draft law. You can get familiarized with it on the website of the ministry. So we've taken this draft law and we've discussed it with all of the stakeholders. We had active consultations with all of them to understand what is taken into account by the law, what is not, what should be amended, and probably we could solve certain issues right now after the public consultations. So what were our conclusions? First of all, our IDPs, and not only they highlighted the fact that the existing government program e-housing in fact does not solve any needs of our IDPs. The problem is that at the level of the resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers, there are criteria identified for the IDPs. So if they try to solve their problems through this e-residence program, the criteria posed by it cannot be fulfilled by any of the IDPs. About only 1% of the IDPs could make benefit of this program. So this e-OSELA program, e-residence program, it should be revamped right now without waiting the adoption of the new legislation. It says that when the IDPs choose their residence, their new residence, they are supposed to pick the apartments in the buildings that were built at least 3 years before that. So if we check out the geography of our IDPs somewhere in, say, Pyryatin or Kropivnitsky or in Lubny, it's quite difficult to find any new housing that was constructed 3 years ago or later, let alone the fact that the IDPs cannot buy any residence in the rural areas. However, there is a demand for that. And I think to support our internally displaced persons, we remember that for the internally displaced persons, the issue of housing is one of those issues that lets us bring our IDPs back to Ukraine, that helps them to stay in Ukraine, to continue working and developing here. And in order to work with the IDPs and e-residents, probably we have to renew other criteria that are covering such issues as the first installment, the matters of the subsidies for the families with more than 3 or more children. So again, there is the similar demand on the side of the veterans, because they currently use the common rate of 7%, and I think it would be just and fair to enable them to use this e-residence program and to get mortgage at 3% rate. Obviously, we will submit all those proposals to the Ministry of Economy and Ministry of Reconstruction to make sure that the Ministry of Economy reviews this rate and probably makes relevant amendments to the existing legislation. Also, talking about e-reconstruction, all of the stakeholders, they highlight the fact that the program is really delivering, and everybody is expecting for the following phase. The following phase is when the residents of the temporarily occupied territories who stay in the territories under Ukrainian control will be getting reimbursement for their destroyed properties which stay in the temporarily occupied territories. There is a huge demand coming from the residents of Mariupol and other destroyed settlements, and currently the occupational authorities, they have started their propaganda campaign saying that the residents of Bakhmut and Soledar can report to occupational administration to be reimbursed in the amount of 35,000 Russian rubles per 1 square meter of destroyed property. And we understand that all those promotions do not produce any positive influence on the Ukrainians, which require support by the government. So we will forward this report on public consultation to the Ministry of Economy, and we hope that implementation of our law, or our draft law, that clearly contemplates that the residents of the temporarily occupied territories are supposed to have guaranteed support from the government and to be reimbursed already. So generally speaking, talking about the results of those public consultations, there was a number of things formulated that I would like to emphasize now. So first of all is the pricing policy I was already mentioning. 1 in 3 citizens cannot afford, under existing conditions, cannot afford using their constitutional right to residence. And yet another matter is the rent. The conditions of rent are not regulated, and the consumers of those services are in no way protected by legislation, and for the state it's one of the tasks to regulate the rent market or lease property market. There is a huge demand to the government to create the strategy of development of housing policy on the state level, and just recently relevant memorandum was signed with the Prime Minister Mr. Shmyhal and the World Bank Group, who will support us in development of this housing strategy. And the existence of such housing strategy is the clear requirement of Ukraine facilities. So we're not entitled to our 50 billion euro if we don't do our homework in a quality manner. So what are the key provisions of this draft law supported by the participants of the consultations? First of all is the creation of the affordable housing fund. All of the representatives of the local governments were saying that it's a huge problem. This fund does not exist. There is no social dwelling, social housing. The IDPs keep coming. Other people who need support are coming. And there is no accommodation for those people so far. Yesterday, EIB has come up with a very intense statement who said that they are ready to spend 400 million euro to support, to help our communities in creation of the pilot projects with the social housing. Hopefully those processes will come in parallel. New legislation will be approved and adopted simultaneously, and EIB will be helping our communities to create the social housing fund, where depending on the income of a family, people could rent such property. Well, the stakeholders in our public consultations highlighted the aspiration to intensify the lending and develop lending mechanisms. We have to develop leasing programs. We have to develop the programs that contemplate the procurement of housing with rent and something like that. So if we check out the experience of the European countries, the private housing is used for social housing purposes, and I hope we will be able to create relevant legislation to make sure the operators of social housing start working in Ukraine too. We were talking about transparency a lot. We were talking about digitalization that keeps penetrating all of the parts of our life, and we suggest creating the joint information analytical housing system, a digital mechanism that would help the people in such a way. For example, they input their details about the existing property, the level of income, the status of those persons, whether they are IDPs or disabled or a family with 3 or more children, and that system would help such individuals to find a matching property for them. So it would be either a mortgage or a social housing or something of a kind. I hope such mechanism will add transparency, and it can also fulfill an enlightenment role to make sure that everybody can use it in case necessary. So we've created such a task list, a homework for our local governments, for cabinet of ministers, and for our Ukrainian central government. So first of all, the local governments are supposed to inventory all of the construction sites to understand whether that housing fund can be used already after having them reformatted for the current needs. Also, the local government should be communicating with their IDPs more actively, specifically with the residents of the communities, to get better understanding of how to solve their housing problems. Again, the parliament has to adopt the legislative framework on fundamentals of the housing policies. Another step is the law on social housing. We are supposed to adopt relevant legislation and develop relevant digital tools, and to create the legislative field to make sure that the private investments may work in the market of social housing, affordable housing for Ukrainians. So that's it on my end in brief. Well, I've come here today with this quite a comprehensive report, which contains just a fraction of those proposals that we are about to submit to our legislators. Well, there's a lot of work ahead. According to your estimates, how long may it take, and how soon are we going to fulfill this homework for the EU, so they are convinced that we fulfill our obligations on part of the housing policy and we're eligible for those 50 billion. Well, I hope that this year the draft law will be already passed to the parliament, and I hope the first reading will be in the coming month of this summer. But there is also a political component. I mean, to what extent the fractions of the parliament will be ready to reject the existing housing code. The first attempt took place in 2009. It was not successful, but I would like all of the representatives of all of the political forces to submerge into those problems related to housing policies, because again, the Euro integration processes and the full-scale invasion just highlighted the level of problems existing in the housing policy. It would be great not to have those legislative spam, but rather to have this comprehensive support in the walls of the parliament. Hopefully the committee will not take long to review the draft law to be submitted, because all of the discussions were already finalized with our international partners, as well as the public consultations with the stakeholders, with, I mean, the veterans, the IDPs, people staying in queue for decades. So hopefully this process will start moving finally. Apart from rescinding the existing housing codes, what may be the other problems that may arise? Well, I don't think that it would be difficult to pass it through the parliament, but talking about the new European rules, we will have to regulate the shadow lease property market. I mean, we're talking about taxes here, if we make this market civilized and transparent, I think that would be a huge task not only for our parliamentarians but also for our citizens to accept it, that yesterday Ukraine has started the official negotiations on accession to European markets, so to European Union, so there should be no black market. You should put aside all of the shadow operations. They are unacceptable in a country that is aspiring to become a part of European Union. So do we orient at our unique experience, or do we copy best practices from the civilized developed countries? Well, obviously we rely upon the European experience. There was a task force represented by a number of different organizations, international organizations like IOM and other active stakeholders. There's an extensive list, and I want to thank all of them. Obviously, we've analyzed the experience of other countries, specifically in part of the affordable property, when they use the private investments and the operators who work with the affordable properties. So again, the best practices are already there, and I would like to highlight that the legislation provides just a huge framework that contemplates a lot of work by the government who is supposed to implement this legislation. And again, we need more support from our international partners, because we can put together a great draft law, but to develop the housing policy, we will need financial support from our partners, and we have a lot of appreciation of the input of European Investment Bank for providing this unique opportunity for development of such projects in Ukraine. Let's check out whether we have questions on the floor. Yulia Bakumova, Ukrinform. Ms. Olena, you've mentioned that there are 600,000 Ukrainian citizens who are in queue to receive their affordable property. Is there any movement in this queue? Are people receiving their new housing under that old legislation? And is this rule going to continue existing in future, given the projected amendments to the legislation of Ukraine? Well, for what I know, out of those 600,000 citizens, about 90,000 plus are the families of the military, and they continue being in queue on and on, and for a lot of them it's not moving at all. Now that the government has enabled this e-residence application to work with the subsidized rate for the military, and given the increase of their salaries, a lot of the military started getting those subsidized loans to solve their housing issues. And it tells us that this mechanism, when you have this provision in your housing code, that you are eligible for 13.9 square meters, and you spend decades in this queue, but as soon as the government provides you with other tools, you start getting an opportunity to buy your own housing. I don't know how this problem with those 600,000 can be solved now. Unfortunately, there's a lot of populism around this issue, a lot of populism in our political life, and a lot of steps were just not taken to make sure that those people get their new properties. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Olena. Let me remind you that we were talking about revamping of Ukrainian government housing policy as a part of the Ukraine Facility Initiative, and we will be back on air at 12 o'clock, and we will be talking about the victory of Ukraine in ECHR. Stay tuned.